Hush now. Save your breath for gasping my name, the giant cowgirl smirked at the timid rancher. Caleb knew the language of the pines and the bite of the wind, the heft of an axe and the cold weight of solitude. For 5 years, the only voice he'd had to answer to was the one in his own head, a hollow echo in the vast emptiness of the Rockies. His cabin was a fortress against memory, its stone hearth a tomb for a life that had burned down to ash. He had come here to be forgotten, to let the seasons grind him down into the same dust as the peaks that surrounded him. Then, she arrived. She was brought by his cousin, a man Caleb hadn't seen in a decade, who was just passing through and owed a debt to her family. Her name was Anya, and she stood on his threshold like a judgment. She was tall, broader in the shoulder than he was, with hands that looked like they knew their way around a problem. There was no plea in her eyes, only a flat, unwavering stare that took in his ragged beard and the unwelcoming set of his jaw. He said you had room, she stated, her voice low and steady, a river running over smooth stones. It wasn't a question. It was a fact being laid at his door. He wanted to refuse, to slam the door on her and the world she represented. But something in that gaze, a resilience that mirrored the ancient granite of the mountains themselves, held him fast. He just grunted and stepped aside, the sound a crack in a silence 5 years deep. The first week was a war of silence. Anya claimed a corner of the one-room cabin and made it her own with a quiet efficiency that grated on Caleb's nerves. He'd wake before dawn to find she was already up, the fire coaxed back to life, her meager belongings arranged with a tidiness that felt like an accusation against his own chaotic grief. He worked his land with a frantic energy, felling trees and splitting logs as if he could drive her away with sheer force of will. But when he would return, exhausted and grim, she would be there. She never asked for anything, never offered meaningless chatter. One day, he watched from the window as she took his spare axe, the one with the unbalanced head he never bothered to fix, and expertly chopped a pile of wood that would have taken him half the morning. She moved with a powerful, rhythmic grace, her breath pluming in the frigid air. He felt a strange, unsettling mix of resentment and admiration. She was not a guest, she was a presence, as undeniable as the winter that was closing its fist around his valley. He spoke only when necessary, his words like chipped stones. "Food's on the hearth, I'm mending your shirt." The sleeve was torn, each exchange was a negotiation of territory. He saw the faint, silvery scars that traced the back of her hands and wondered what harsh life had put them there. He found himself listening for the soft sound of her breathing in the dark after the fire had died down, a foreign rhythm in the symphony of his isolation. He hated it. He hated that her presence made the cabin feel both smaller and infinitely less empty. The silence was no longer his own, it was shared, and it had a weight, a tension that hummed between them like a taut wire. He was a man who had perfected the art of being alone, and she, with her silent competence and unyielding presence, was undoing all of it without speaking a single word. The slow burn of the passing days began to change the quality of their silence. It was no longer a weapon but a language. He learned the meaning of the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her eyes would soften when she watched the snow fall. He started leaving a second cup of coffee by the fire in the mornings, and she started leaving a neatly patched tear in one of his work coats on his cot. They were two solitary creatures orbiting one another in the tight confines of the cabin, their paths slowly, inevitably, converging. He found himself studying her, this woman who was as rugged as the land itself. She was not beautiful in the way of the soft women from his past life, but her face had a strength that was far more compelling. It was a landscape of its own, carved by hardship but not broken by it. One afternoon, he found her staring at the small, faded photograph he kept on the mantelpiece, the only remnant of his wife and son. He braced himself for the pity, for the clumsy questions that always came. But Anya said nothing. She simply traced a finger over the glass, a gesture of such profound and quiet understanding that it struck him speechless. In that moment, he realized she wasn't just a survivor, she was a keeper of sorrows, just like him. She understood that some wounds were too deep for words. That night, for the first time, he didn't feel the familiar, crushing weight of his loss. He felt seen. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 5 years receded, just a little, pushed back by the steady, quiet light of her presence. The winter outside howled, but inside the cabin, a fragile warmth was beginning to take root in the frozen ground of his heart. The storm came without warning, a white fury that descended from the peaks and swallowed the world whole. It was a blizzard of mythic proportions, burying the cabin up to its eaves in a matter of hours. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the world beyond their single window dissolved into a churning chaos of snow. For the first time, Caleb felt a flicker of fear. This was not a storm to be weathered, it was one to be survived. And he was no longer just responsible for himself. He looked at Anya, who was calmly checking the seals on the door, her expression unreadable but focused. The shared crisis ignited a new dynamic between them. There was no room for tension or pride, only for the stark reality of survival. "The livestock," he said, his voice raw. "The new calf will freeze." Before he could argue, she was already pulling on her heaviest coat. "We'll go together. It'll take two to make it through this drift." They fought their way to the small barn, a journey of 50 yards that felt like a mile. The wind tore at them, stealing their breath and blinding them with ice. Inside, the terrified animals huddled together. The newborn calf was shivering, its mother lowing pitifully. Working as a seamless unit, they fortified the barn, stuffing cracks with straw and banking snow against the walls for insulation. He moved with the brute strength of desperation, she with a calm, methodical purpose. He watched her gentle the frantic mother cow, her low voice a soothing murmur against the storm's rage. In her, he saw a strength that wasn't just physical, but primal. A deep, unshakable core of endurance. They fought their way back to the cabin, collapsing inside, their chests heaving. The world was gone, erased by the whiteout. There was only the two of them, the roaring fire, and the howling wind. The crisis hadn't broken them, it had forged them into something new. A team. A partnership. A single unit against the indifferent cruelty of nature. In the aftermath of the blizzard, the cabin became a sanctuary. The storm raged for 3 days, cutting them off from everything but each other. The silence that returned was different, softer. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who had faced a common enemy and won. They rationed their food, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. He would tend the fire, she would melt snow for water. They sat across from each other at the small table, the storm a distant roar, and for the first time, the space between them felt not like a divide, but like a shared territory. One night, as the fire cast long shadows on the walls, Caleb found himself speaking. The words came out rusty and hesitant, pulled from a place he had long since boarded up. "I built this place for her," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "For Sarah. And for our boy, Thomas." Anya didn't turn to him, but he felt her attention, a focused, patient listening. He told her about the fever that had swept through their old settlement, a cruel thief that had taken everything in a matter of days. He spoke of the silence that came after, a silence so profound it had driven him up into these mountains, seeking a quiet that matched the one inside him. He spoke until his voice was raw, emptying 5 years of unspeakable grief into the warm air of the cabin. When he finished, a single tear tracked a path through the grime on his cheek. He felt hollowed out, exposed. Anya finally turned to look at him, her eyes deep and clear in the firelight. She didn't offer condolences or empty platitudes. She simply reached across the table and laid her hand over his. Her touch was warm, her grip firm. "My father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a good man. But the drink made him mean. The scars, he gave them to me. I left the day I was big enough to stop him. It was a confession for a confession. A trade of wounds." In that moment, the last of his defenses crumbled. She was not just a survivor. She was a warrior. And he was no longer alone in his fortress of pain. The thought came first to the cabin, then to the world outside. With their histories laid bare between them, the very air seemed to shimmer with a new, unspoken energy. The forced proximity that had once been a source of conflict now became a crucible for a fragile, burgeoning intimacy. Caleb found his eyes following her constantly, mesmerized by the economy of her movements, the solid line of her back as she stood looking out the window, the way a loose strand of hair would catch the morning light. The cabin, once his refuge from feeling, was now filled with it. Every accidental brush of their hands as they passed in the narrow space sent a jolt through him. He would lie awake on his cot, listening to her steady breathing, and feel a profound, aching yearning that both terrified and thrilled him. He had forgotten what it was like to want. He had buried that part of himself with his family. Yet, here it was, being resurrected by this quiet, powerful woman who had stumbled into his life. He saw the way she watched him too, her gaze lingering a moment too long when she thought he wasn't looking. The sparse dialogue between them became charged with subtext. A simple thank you for a hot meal felt like a declaration. A shared look across the fire held a conversation all its own. The world outside was slowly waking up, the sound of dripping water from the melting eaves a constant, gentle rhythm. It was the sound of change, of a long freeze coming to an end. Inside Caleb, a similar thaw was taking place. The ice around his heart was cracking, melting away under the steady warmth of her presence, revealing the vulnerable, beating thing he thought had died years ago. He was falling in love with her, a terrifying, exhilarating freefall into the unknown. The tension became an almost physical presence in the small cabin, a third occupant that breathed in the spaces between them. Caleb felt like a man walking a wire, every word, every glance fraught with a meaning he was too afraid to name. He was a hermit, a man who had fled from the complexities of the heart, and now he was drowning in them. He knew she would have to leave soon. The pass would be clear in a week or two, and she had never spoken of staying. The thought of the silence returning, a true and empty silence this time, was a physical pain in his chest. He couldn't bear it. He wouldn't. He had to say something, but the words were foreign, rusted from disuse. She was the one who broke the stalemate. She was packing her small bag one afternoon, the movements deliberate and final. "The snow is melting," she said, not looking at him. "I'll be able to travel in a few days." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The future he hadn't dared to imagine was being dismantled before his eyes. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. "No," he said, the word a ragged sound torn from his throat. She stopped, her back still to him. "What did you say?" He strode across the room, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stood behind her, so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her. He didn't know the right words, the poetic phrases. He only knew the raw, brutal truth. "Don't go," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Stay." She turned slowly, her face a mask of careful neutrality, but her eyes, her incredible, steady eyes, were searching his. "Why, Caleb?" she asked, her voice soft but demanding. "Give me a reason to stay." And so he did. He told her everything, not with pretty words, but with the desperate, unvarnished truth of a man starved for life. "Because this isn't just a cabin anymore. It's a home. And it's not a home without you in it." The confession hung in the air, raw and shimmering. Anya's eyes, which had seen so much hardship and held so much back, were now wide with a vulnerable light he'd never seen before. She took a step closer, erasing the last of the distance between them. She raised a hand, her calloused fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw, a touch that was both a question and an answer. He saw the past 5 years of solitude, of grief, of cold emptiness, reflected in her gaze, and he saw the promise of an end to all of it. He leaned into her touch, his own hands coming up to rest on her waist, feeling the solid, strong reality of her. This was real. This was happening. A life he thought was over was beginning again. A small, wry smile touched her lips, a flicker of the unflinching woman he first met. "You've been quiet for 5 years, Caleb," she murmured, her voice a low, intimate rumble. "You sure you want to start talking now?" He couldn't speak. He could only pull her closer, burying his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in her scent of pine smoke and winter air and something that was uniquely her. It was the scent of survival, of strength, of home. Her arms wrapped around him, a powerful, grounding embrace that made him feel safe for the first time since he'd lost everything. She held him for a long moment, simply letting him be, letting the weight of his confession settle. Then she pulled back just enough to look him in the eye, her gaze now burning with an intensity that stole his breath. The wry smile softened into something tender, something proprietary. It was the look of a woman claiming her territory. Her voice dropped to a husky whisper, a command that was also an invitation. "Hush now," she said, her thumb stroking his lip. "Save your breath. You'll need it for gasping my name." His name on her lips was a prayer and a punctuation, the end of one life and the beginning of another. The act that followed was not a frantic collision but a slow, deliberate discovery. It was the mapping of scars, both visible and invisible. It was a language spoken not with words but with touch, with breath, with the steady, thundering beat of two hearts finally in rhythm. He, who had been so lost in his own head, was brought crashing into the beautiful, undeniable reality of his own body, of her body. She led him with a confident tenderness, showing him that vulnerability was not a weakness but a form of strength, a necessary surrender. In her arms, he was not a hermit or a widower, he was just a man, being brought back to life. The fire in the hearth, which had been their constant companion, roared and danced, casting their shadows against the walls like giants, their forms merging into one. It was a union not just of bodies, but of two fractured souls finding their missing pieces in each other. It was the ultimate defiance of the silence and the sorrow that had haunted those walls for so long. The morning came, soft and pale, light spilling through the window onto the tangled blankets. For the first time, Caleb woke not to the heavy cloak of loneliness but to the warm weight of Anya's arm slung across his chest. He watched her sleep, the fierce lines of her face softened, and felt a wave of profound, bone-deep peace wash over him. He was home. He had been a mountain, unmoving and desolate, but she was the spring thaw, the relentless, life-giving force that had broken through the ice and rock to find the river that still flowed underneath. The cabin was no longer a fortress, it was a promise. Spring arrived in the valley like a benediction. The snow receded, revealing the rich, dark earth, and the world exploded into a riot of green. The air, once sharp with frost, was now soft and filled with the scent of pine and damp soil and new beginnings. Caleb and Anya worked side by side, their movements a familiar dance. They repaired the barn, planted a garden, and mended fences that had been broken by the weight of the snow and the weight of neglect. The ranch, which had been a place of solitary labor for Caleb, was now a shared dream, a future they were building with their own two hands. The silence between them remained, but it was a different creature entirely. It was the rich, deep silence of perfect understanding, of two people so in tune with one another that words were often unnecessary. It was punctuated by easy laughter and quiet conversation, by the simple, profound joy of companionship. He would watch her from across the field, her tall frame strong against the backdrop of the mountains, and a fierce, protective love would swell in his chest, so powerful it was almost painful. She had not just saved him from his solitude, she had shown him how to live again. She was his storm, his shelter, his anchor, and his horizon. The cabin was filled with light and warmth, the hearth no longer a tomb but the vibrant, beating heart of their home. It was a story that had begun with an ending but had, against all odds, found its true beginning. Dear friends, we often build walls around our hearts to protect ourselves from the storms of life, believing that solitude is the only safe harbor. But sometimes, the greatest strength is found not in weathering the storm alone, but in letting someone else in to share the shelter. Caleb believed his story was over, yet his truest chapter was waiting just on the other side of a door he was forced to open. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Have you ever found a home in the most unexpected person, a connection that rebuilt you from the ground up? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of love and resilience, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales that explore the wild, untamed country of the human heart. Thank you for listening.